Westminster Abbey, November 20th, 1947. 200 million people across the British Empire strain to hear every word as Princess Elizabeth makes her vows to the dashing naval officer at her side. The Abbey is packed with royalty from across Europe. Kings, queens, grand duchesses, princes. The golden blur of tiaras catches the light. Everyone who matters is here, except 3 women. Prince Philip's sisters, Margarita, Theodora and Sophie, are nowhere to be seen. They are alive. They are not estranged, but they have not been invited to their only brother's wedding. The official reason, whispered in diplomatic circles but never stated outright, is devastatingly simple. It was unacceptable. Unacceptable because just 2 years earlier, Britain had been at war with Germany. Unacceptable because Philip's 3 surviving sisters had all married German aristocrats. And unacceptable because those aristocrats were not just German, they were Nazis. Margarita's husband Gottfried had joined the Nazi Party in 1937, membership number 4023070, and fought on the Eastern Front. Theodora's husband Berthold had served in the Wehrmacht, and Sophie's husband Christoph had been an SS Oberführer and director in Goering's air ministry. Sophie herself had joined the Nazi Women's League and named her firstborn son Karl Adolf after Adolf Hitler. This is the story of how post-war Britain looked at the man about to become their future queen's consort and saw not just his distinguished Royal Navy service, but the shadow of 3 sisters who had stood on the wrong side of history's most devastating war. The question isn't just whether the British establishment thought Philip's sisters made him unfit to marry Elizabeth. It's darker than that. Did anyone, the public, the government, King himself, truly believe Philip could be trusted? Or was he, like his sisters, forever marked by his German blood? To understand what post-war Britain really thought of Prince Philip's Nazi sisters, we need to understand something crucial. They didn't start out as Nazis. Philip's 4 sisters were all considerably older than him. Margarita, the eldest, was born in 1905. Then came Theodora in 1906, Cecilia in 1911, and Sophie in 1914. Philip himself wasn't born until 1921, the only son in a family of daughters. By the time he was old enough to have memories of his sisters, they were already married and gone. They married in rapid succession between 1930 and 1931, strategic dynastic marriages, as was expected of European royalty. Margarita married Gottfried, Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg. Theodora married Berthold, Margrave of Baden. Cecilia married Georg Donatus, hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse. And Sophie married Prince Christoph of Hesse. Here's what's crucial. These marriages happened before Hitler came to power. When these young women, ages 16 to 26, married their German princes, Hitler was still a fringe political figure. He wouldn't become Chancellor until January 1933. They didn't marry Nazis, they married German aristocrats, who later became Nazis. But by 1947, that distinction meant nothing to the British public. There was a photograph, one single photograph, that more than any document or testimony seemed to prove that Philip was inescapably tied to the Nazi regime. November 23rd, 1937, Darmstadt, Germany. The funeral of Princess Cecilia, who had died 7 days earlier in a plane crash that also killed her husband, their 2 young sons, her mother-in-law, and the premature baby born during the crash itself. Philip was 16 years old, a student at Gordonston School in Scotland, and Cecilia had been his favourite sister. The photograph shows Philip standing second from the right in a row of mourners, flanked by Nazi officers in full uniform. Behind them, crowds line the streets giving the Nazi salute. Swastika flags hang from buildings. The funeral had been transformed into a massive Nazi propaganda event, what contemporary reports described as a pretext for a grand display of soldiers in Nazi uniform. And there, in the middle of it all, stood the future Duke of Edinburgh. Philip's headmaster at Gordonston later recalled that the young prince's grief was that of a man. But what the British public would see when this photograph eventually surfaced was something else entirely. A royal prince surrounded by Nazis at a Nazi funeral in Nazi Germany. The truth was more complicated. Philip had no choice about the funeral's staging. His 16-year-old self didn't organise the event. The Nazi salute was mandatory at public gatherings in Germany by 1937. His grief was genuine and devastating. But photographs don't capture complexity. They capture a single frozen moment, and this moment, more than anything else, would haunt Philip for the rest of his life. It didn't help that his other sisters continued their associations with the regime. Sophie and her husband Christoph became enthusiastic Nazis. In letters to relatives, they wrote things like, "We are all terribly excited about the elections." They had lunch with Hitler. They named their son after him. In her memoirs written decades later, Sophie admitted, "Although Cree and I changed our political view fundamentally some years later, we were impressed by this charming and seemingly modest man, and by his plans to change and improve the situation in Germany." Margareta and Gottfried joined the Nazi Party on May 1st, 1937. The same day, Cecilia and her husband joined. Gottfried fought on the Eastern Front and was severely wounded. Only Theodora and her husband Berthold tried to maintain distance from the regime, though Berthold still served briefly in the Wehrmacht before being exempted due to injury. So when the British establishment looked at Philip in 1947, they saw a man whose 3 surviving sisters had all been, to varying degrees, complicit in the Nazi regime. The question was, did that make him complicit too? Behind closed doors, the British government was asking harder questions. In 1946, before the engagement was even official, King George VI ordered Scotland Yard's Special Branch to compile a secret dossier on Philip's background, loyalties, and politics. MI5 officers investigated everything: his German relatives, his romantic history, even whether he could be trusted to remain faithful if he married Elizabeth. The surveillance reports noted Philip's foul language, his Canadian girlfriend Osla Benning, and most critically, the Nazi connections of Philip's sisters through their marriages. The establishment wasn't just concerned about public opinion, they genuinely worried whether Philip himself might be a security risk. The fear wasn't completely irrational. Philip's brother-in-law Christoph had been high-ranking SS, an Oberfuhrer, equivalent to a senior colonel. He'd held a directorship in Goering's air ministry. During the war, 2 of Philip's brothers-in-law had fought for Germany against Britain. Philip himself had fought for Britain against Germany, yes, but he'd also been trained at German schools, spoke fluent German, and had spent significant time in Germany during the 1930s. The question the intelligence services were really asking was this: where does loyalty actually lie? In the country you fight for, or in the family you're born into? King George VI clearly had his doubts. According to The Secret Royals, a book by historians Richard Aldrich and Rory Cormack based on declassified MI5 files, the king's eyes and ears doubted whether Philip would be faithful if he married Elizabeth. The surveillance wasn't just about the Nazi connections. It was about whether Philip, this foreign-born prince with his complicated German family, could truly be trusted at the heart of the British monarchy. The solution the establishment arrived at was brutal in its simplicity. The sisters could not attend the wedding. King George VI personally decreed that Philip's German relatives, including all 3 surviving sisters, were banned from Westminster Abbey. As one historical account put it, in post-war Britain, it was unacceptable for any of Philip's German relations, including his 3 surviving sisters, to be invited to the wedding. The only exception was Philip's mother, Princess Alice. She had taken a very different path during the war than her daughters. She'd sheltered a Jewish family in Athens during the Nazi occupation, at risk to her own life. Alice was heroic, her daughters were not. Alice could attend, her daughters could not. But here's what's rarely discussed: what this cost Philip himself. Philip had already lost his family once. His parents' marriage had collapsed when he was young. His mother suffered a mental breakdown and was institutionalized. His father went into exile in Monte Carlo. His sisters all married and moved to Germany. By the time Philip was 10 years old, he was essentially an orphan, not because his parents had died, but because his family had simply fragmented. He later described this period with characteristic emotional restraint. It just happened. The family broke up. My mother was ill, my sisters were married, my father was in the south of France. I just had to get on with it. You do. And now, in 1947, at what should have been the happiest moment of his life, he was being forced to choose again. The message was clear. You can have your royal future with Elizabeth, but only if you publicly distance yourself from your past, from your sisters, from your German family. Philip chose Elizabeth. The sisters were not invited. Lady Pamela Hicks, Philip's cousin, later revealed what happened when the sisters finally saw Philip years later. They asked him, "Why weren't we allowed to come to your wedding?" The question haunted him, because the answer was that he'd prioritized his future over his family. He'd made the pragmatic choice, the only choice available to him really, but it was still a choice that created a wound. What most people don't know is that Philip maintained the relationship privately. He quietly paid for his German nieces and nephews' education. He visited his sisters discreetly. He never publicly defended them. That would have been politically impossible. But he never abandoned them either. He lived with this divided loyalty for 75 years. He fought for Britain. He served Britain. He became Britain's longest-serving consort. But part of him never stopped being the brother of Margarita, Theodora, Cecilia, and Sophie. November 16th, 1937, 10 years before the wedding, and the moment that would define how Britain saw Philip's German connections for the rest of his life. The plane carrying Princess Cecilia, her husband Georg, their 2 young sons, and Georg's mother, took off from Darmstadt heading for London. They were flying to attend a family wedding. Cecilia was 8 months pregnant. Somewhere over Belgium, near Ostend, the plane crashed. Everyone on board died. When rescue workers reached the wreckage, they found something that made the tragedy even more horrific: the remains of a premature infant near Cecilia's body. She'd gone into labour during the crash. The baby had been born in the last moments before impact. Philip was 16, a student at Gordonston. His headmaster, Kurt Hahn, later recalled that when Philip received the news, his grief was that of a man. "I have the very clearest recollection of the profound shock with which he heard the news of the accident and the death of his sister and her family. But the funeral that followed became something else entirely." The Nazi regime saw an opportunity. The funeral was scheduled for November 23rd, exactly 1 week after the crash. In that week, the Nazis transformed what should have been a private family tragedy into a massive propaganda event. Thousands of soldiers in Nazi uniform lined the streets of Darmstadt. Swastika banners hung from every building. Crowds were organised to give the Nazi salute and shout "Heil Hitler" as the funeral procession passed. Philip had to attend. This was his favourite sister. But attending meant stepping into the heart of Nazi Germany at the height of Hitler's power. Contemporary accounts describe the scene: a 16-year-old British prince walking through streets filled with Nazi imagery, surrounded by SS officers in full regalia, while crowds gave the Nazi salute. Photographs captured him standing next to high-ranking Nazi officials. The funeral wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a Nazi celebration of one of their own. And here's what made it even more complicated. By November 1937, Cecilia and her husband Georg had joined the Nazi Party. They'd signed up in May of that year, just 6 months before the crash. Whether they were true believers or just pragmatists trying to survive in Nazi Germany, we'll never know. They died before they could make that clear. What we do know is that this funeral was the first time Philip's parents had seen each other in 6 years. It was a reunion of a broken family in the worst possible circumstances, staged against the backdrop of Nazi pageantry. Philip, it was the moment when his German family and the Nazi regime became inextricably linked in his own experience. 10 years later, when the British establishment debated whether Philip's sisters should attend his wedding, they remembered this funeral. They remembered the photographs of him surrounded by Nazis. They remembered that his sister had been buried with Nazi honours, and they decided no. The risk to the monarchy's image was too great. So what did post-war Britain actually think of Prince Philip's Nazi sisters? The answer depends entirely on who you ask. The British public. Germans were the enemy, full stop. For ordinary British citizens in 1947, the wounds of war were still raw. The Blitz had ended only 6 years earlier. Families were still mourning sons, brothers, husbands lost in combat. The revelations of the Holocaust, the full horror of the concentration camps, were fresh and devastating. Anti-German sentiment had reached its peak during the war, and it hadn't dissipated by 1947. Historical accounts from the period describe a Britain where Germans, regardless of their individual actions, were viewed with deep suspicion. Historian Kirk Graham notes that Germanophobic Britons considered the quest for a good German to be in vain. Nazis or not, they argued, there would be no peace as long as Germany endured. In this climate, The idea that the future Queen's husband had 3 sisters married to Nazi Party members was genuinely shocking. It didn't matter that Philip himself had fought bravely in the Royal Navy. It didn't matter that he'd been too young to have any agency in his sisters' marriages. Much of the British public, blood ties to Nazis made you suspect by association. The sentiment was likely strongest among British veterans who had fought against Germany. These men had faced German soldiers in combat. Some had liberated concentration camps. 2 of Philip's brothers-in-law, Christoph and Gottfried, had fought for the other side. The idea that one of those brothers-in-law had been an SS Oberführer would have been almost incomprehensible. How could a man whose sister was married to an SS officer become consort to the future Queen? The British government and palace officials had a different set of concerns. They weren't primarily worried about morality or justice. They were worried about perception and stability. The House of Windsor had its own complicated German heritage. The family had changed their name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor in 1917, precisely because of anti-German sentiment during World War I. Edward VIII's Nazi sympathies were an open secret in government circles, though carefully hidden from the public. The establishment knew that British royalty and German aristocracy were deeply intertwined. That's exactly why Philip's sisters were so dangerous. Their presence at the wedding wouldn't just remind people that Philip had German relatives, it would remind people that all of British royalty had German relatives. As one historical account notes, Philip's family ties to Germany frightened the British court and government, who feared the public might remember the House of Windsor's Germanic origins. The MI5 dossier on Philip reveals the establishment's anxiety. They investigated everything about him because they needed to be absolutely certain he could be controlled, that he understood where his loyalties must lie. The decision to ban the sisters from the wedding wasn't primarily about punishing them, it was about managing a public relations crisis before it could begin. King George VI's order was explicit. The sisters could not attend. It was unacceptable. That word, unacceptable, appears repeatedly in official and unofficial accounts. Not inappropriate or inadvisable, unacceptable. A complete prohibition. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother, had her own reasons for despising Philip's German connections. Her brother Fergus had died in World War I, killed by German forces. She had never forgiven the Germans for that loss, and she extended that hostility to Philip's family. According to historical accounts, the Queen Mother expressed open disgust for Germans because they had killed her brother Fergus in the First World War. She went so far as to instruct her ladies-in-waiting that they did not have to curtsy to Philip's sisters. This wasn't just political calculation, it was personal grief transformed into generational hatred. The Queen Mother saw Philip's German family as a reminder of everything she'd lost. She was deeply skeptical of Philip as a match for her daughter, and the Nazi connections of his sisters gave her concrete ammunition for that skepticism. The British media faced an impossible position. They knew about Philip's sisters. They knew about the Nazi connections. It was the story of the decade, a future royal consort with direct family ties to the regime Britain had just defeated. But they couldn't publish it, whether through official pressure or self-censorship in the name of national interest. The British press maintained a near-complete silence about Philip's sisters during the engagement and wedding period. Coverage focused obsessively on Philip's naval service, his charming personality, Elizabeth's obvious love for him. The German family was mentioned, if at all, only in the vaguest terms. This silence lasted for decades. The full story of Philip's sisters and their Nazi connections didn't become widely known public knowledge until after Philip's death in 2021, when newspapers finally felt free to publish the details. And what did Philip think? He never said, not publicly, not for 60 years. In 2006, near the end of his life, Philip finally addressed his family's wartime connections in an interview. He said that his relatives, like many others, had found hope in Hitler's early promises. It was the closest he ever came to discussing the subject publicly. What we know from his actions suggests a man torn between loyalties he could never fully reconcile. He fought for Britain. He served Britain faithfully for 7 decades, but he also quietly maintained relationships with his German family. He paid for their children's education. He visited them privately. And when he died in 2021, he specifically requested that his German relatives be invited to his funeral. Finally, after 74 years, reuniting the two families at a royal event. Lady Pamela Hicks revealed one detail that speaks volumes. Even decades after the wedding, Philip's sisters asked him, "Why weren't we allowed to come to your wedding?" They never received a satisfying answer because there wasn't one. The answer was, because you were German and you married Nazis, and that made you politically impossible. Here's what post-war Britain couldn't or wouldn't see. The sisters themselves were more complicated than the label Nazi wives suggested. Margarita and Theodora were teenagers when they married, ages 16 and 17. They had no say in their husband's political choices. Theodora and her husband Berthold actually tried to maintain distance from the Nazi regime, though Berthold still served in the Wehrmacht because refusal would have meant execution. Even Sophie, the most enthusiastic Nazi among them, eventually changed. By the end of her life, she acknowledged in her memoirs that she and Christoph had fundamentally changed their political views. In 1994, Philip brought Sophie to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem. The woman who had once named her son after Hitler stood at the memorial to Hitler's victims. It was an act of witness transformation, private redemption made public. But in 1947, none of that complexity mattered. Britain had just emerged from the most devastating war in human history. 6 years of total war, hundreds of thousands dead, cities destroyed, an empire exhausted. The British public wasn't in the mood for nuance about Nazis. The establishment made a cold calculation. Philip's service to Britain outweighed his family's service to Germany, but only if the family was kept invisible. Philip could be the war hero who married the future queen, but his sisters had to disappear from the narrative. On April 17th, 2021, Prince Philip was buried at Windsor Castle. The funeral was small, limited by COVID restrictions to just 30 attendees. Among them were 3 of Philip's German relatives, the children and grandchildren of his sisters. It had taken 74 years, but Philip had finally succeeded in bringing his two families together at a royal event. German relatives at Windsor Castle, attending a British royal funeral. The thing that had been unacceptable in 1947 was privately accepted in 2021. One of his German great-nephews said it felt like an incredible honour to attend. 74 years after being excluded from Philip's wedding, the family was finally welcomed to say goodbye. So what did post-war Britain really think of Prince Philip's Nazi sisters? The establishment thought they were a political liability that had to be managed through exclusion and silence. The public, had they known the full extent of the connections, would likely have been horrified and suspicious. The Queen Mother thought they were personal reminders of German evil. The press thought they were a story too dangerous to tell. But Philip himself saw something different. He saw Margarita, Theodora, Cecilia and Sophie, 4 women who were his family long before they became footnotes in Britain's war history. Women who had made choices, some terrible, some beyond their control. Women he loved despite everything. The British establishment forced him to choose between his past and his future. He chose his future with Elizabeth, but he spent the rest of his life quietly maintaining his past, visiting his sisters privately, supporting their children, never defending them publicly, because that would have been political suicide, but never abandoning them either. The cost of that divided loyalty was a 75-year silence, a silence that ended only in death, when he could finally, publicly, reunite the worlds he'd kept separated his entire life. Perhaps the real question isn't what post-war Britain thought of Philip's Nazi sisters. It's what it cost Philip himself to live with being the brother they could never acknowledge.